the first thing I'd say is this is not your father's insurgency, right? This is a different kind of animal, I think, altogether than when we talk about traditional insurgency situations. There's no central political direction, like we've seen with many other classical insurgencies. There's no central military command. There's no central military or no nationwide military strategy being employed by the rebels. I've used the historical analogy in the past, and like all historical analogies, it's flawed, right? But this is somewhat like the French resistance early in World War II, and without de Gaulle and without a Churchill to hammer them into shape, right? So it's a very different kind of thing we're looking at here. The armed resistance, in fact, the whole resistance it's a complex phenomenon in the traditional sense of complexity theory, right? Lots of different actors, deeply connected, many different processes underway, and so on. It's also a self-organizing phenomenon. There's been no overarching plan or concept for building the armed opposition in Syria. In many ways, it just happened as a result of various events, events on the ground. And it's also an evolving and adaptive phenomenon. It keeps changing. It's not what it was in March of 2011, and in 6 months from now, it's going to look different than it does today. So it's a thing in motion. There are, I think, some important analytical challenges involved in looking at the Syrian opposition, armed and otherwise. I spent a long time doing intelligence analysis on the Middle East, and this is as formidable a problem, I think, as you can imagine, just to get your head around, to try and understand, to figure out what is in fact going on and so on. It's a big data problem, right? There is tons of data, unorganized data on the Syrian opposition. And just trying to look at that, the flow of information, it has major challenges in and of itself. There are many multiples of diverse sources, ranging from good, reliable, to totally unreliable, interested in sources that are trying to push the situation in one way or one direction or another. There are also, I think, some dangers involved in the analysis of this, and I'm as subject to these dangers as anybody. There's a danger of getting too up close and personal with the resistance. Many of the leaders and people involved in the resistance, individual resistance leaders and so on, are highly attractive characters. They're definitely interesting. They're doing real stuff. Some of them are even romantic figures, right? In the 19th century sense of romantic figure. And that's troublesome, right? Because that puts an impression on the analysis, of the rebel forces, I think, or can put it on. A second danger is being swept up in the tides of battle, right? And this is something that I try and fight against, not always successfully. But events in Syria move rapidly, and they often move in contradictory directions. So when people lay down, including me, lay down and say, this is what's happening and this is the way it's going, you have to say, okay, but, maybe not, right? So you have to be very careful about, saying that the situation is definitely headed in one direction. It will change. We have seen multiple changes in the course of the war over time. We're probably going to see more changes, regardless of what the United States does. And related to that, there's a big problem, I think, with instant analysis. When something major happens in the course of the war, there's a flocking to that event, and a lot of emphasis, put on a single event, drives analysis, for some time. This is when I did current intelligence at the Pentagon, we used to see this amongst ourselves all the time, that, the present looms large, right? And trying to put these events into perspective, put them into context is hard. Sources I use for the paper, it's basically all open sources. They had some discussions with government people and so on, but this is an open source project. Relies on opposition and activist reporting, the regime and reporting of its allies. So lots of social media stuff, YouTube, heavily involved in what I do, conventional media, contacts with journalists, field work, all those kinds of things underlie basically my conclusions. Another important piece of the story here is, in a sense, on this, you always need to do net assessment, right? You can never consider the rebels in isolation. You always have to think about them in terms of what kind of a challenge the regime forces are posing to them. And we see, I think, a very serious regime challenge. The regime is not, a great military force. It doesn't have great military forces. The Syrian army is not a great army. Its irregular forces are not great forces. But in this war, they proved to be good enough to keep the regime in power for over 2 years. So, in this war, the regime forces aren't too bad. They have certain advantages, I think, over the rebels, persisting advantages, not just transient ones. The fundamental one, I think, is the continuing firepower the regime forces have. Firepower, artillery, missiles, air, and now, we see chemical. The regime has the ability to deploy forces and coordinate their firepower. The regime is pretty effective and actually getting better at it in massing forces where they really think it's important and operating them in an effective fashion. And probably, I think, the single most important thing the regime has done in the war was to raise, organize, train, and deploy large numbers of irregular forces. This aspect of the regime's behavior has basically kept the regime in the war. This is the Shabiha, the popular committees, the local militias, volunteers, and so on. The regime has been successful in generating large numbers, tens of thousands of these people, and getting them to fight better over time. Again, not perfectly, but not too bad. More recently, we've seen the entry into the war of significant Allied forces on the side of the regime. The key aspect of one of two key aspects, let's say, of the Qusair battle in June was the entry into the battle by large numbers of Hezbollah forces. Okay. They also weren't world beaters. They had their own problems and issues. The Hezbollah troops didn't prove to be elite soldiers either, but they were a lot better than anything the regime had. What they provided was reliable light infantry that would execute their orders and die in trying to do that. This is something that regime regulars don't always show the willingness to do. So the injection of Hezbollah forces gave the regime the ability to fight effectively on the ground in Qusair. They took a lot of losses. And finally, amongst these important regime challenges, I'd say, is the will to win. In war, will counts for a lot, right? And the regime definitely has the will to win. They are united in that. They are determined to persevere through the war. They're determined to do whatever it takes, as we've seen again, to win this war. Not just to sort of force it to a stalemate, not to go to Geneva II with an improved diplomatic position, but to win on the battlefield. So what's the current military situation? I think the basic factors in it we see it's the increasingly sectarian nature of the war. That's been talked about a great deal. The increasingly important foreign involvement on both sides, actually. Use by both sides of heavy weapons, increasing use by heavy weapons by the rebels. The ability of both sides to sustain relatively high levels of combat. It's pretty impressive that the regime and the rebels have been able to fight the way they have over the amount of time they have. Increasing combat casualties on both sides. I'll talk about this a little more. Both sides are losing lots of people in the fighting. Many more
combatants, fighters, are being killed than civilians in the war. Civilians are being killed in significant numbers, but military casualties are higher. And another major characteristic of the conflict that we see is that there's still a lack of anything that remotely looks like decisive operations. The war is essentially a regional war. It's not a war of sweeping maneuvers. It's not a war that's conducted on a national basis. Okay, so when I look at the when I tried to say, okay, how to analytically look at this animal, you sort of have to have some kind of a framework of analysis. And there are lots of pieces to the rebel forces, and I came up with 10 things we ought to think about, right? That's not a small number, but it's more than a couple. A lot of the discussion you hear about the rebels either focuses on what kind of weapons they've got, or on whether they're Salafists or moderates. Right? Probably 80% of the discussion of the armed opposition focuses on those kinds of things. Maybe that's a generalization, but anyway. The first thing about the rebel forces is what's their nature. What's kind of the sociology and ideology of these of the rebel forces, and we see very broad spectrum here. The rebels come from all elements of Syrian society, right? They represent a huge spectrum, ideologically, from moderates, which are actually relatively hard to find, all the way to Jihadi Salafis, right? The order of battle is the second factor I looked at. The rebel forces fall into the category of irregulars or guerrillas. You're not a standard, well-formed, organized force. And the actual order of battle for the rebels, I think, remains a mystery. It's a mystery we have some inkling about, and some, we can see some pieces of an order of battle, but we really can't discern the exact structure, organization, laydown, of the rebel forces. It's for sure the rebel combat units number in the hundreds, right? And if you believe some reports, it could be in the thousands. But they're just a mass of rebel units, and they range in size from maybe a handful of people or a couple of handfuls of people to a few thousand people, or maybe even somewhat larger. So you have this very great spread of units. Rebel command and control is another very difficult thing to figure out. What we see is multiple command-type structures, and in the paper I put command kind of in quotes, because there are at least 9 different command-type structures that have been identified, and these vary from highly formalistic and broad command and control structures that may have actual little influence on the battlefield, to very odd, ad hoc, and local type command structures, controlling just a relatively small number of forces. So you have this very great variation in how the rebels are actually operating. The main point I think here is, and I alluded to this at the beginning, is that there is no overall command structure. Right? There is no group anywhere, including in the Supreme Military Council, that actually commands the forces that are doing the fighting inside Syria. There are a bunch of local and regional groups that command forces, but there is no national command. The weapons the rebels have are significant now. There's been a notion, I think, and I think this is dying out now, but there's been a notion for a long time that the rebels are these kind of lightly armed guys with some Kalashnikovs and general-purpose machine guns and some RPGs, and they're taking on this this Goliath in the Syrian army. Well, the little Davids out there, the Mohammeds, they're getting heavy weapons, and a lot of them. They operate tanks, they operate field artillery, they operate BMPs. They now looks like they have lots of anti-tank guided missiles. The number of those things seems to be growing. So much of what they've taken or are using, they've taken from government stocks.
The anti-tank guided missiles, and it looks like more of those are coming in from outside, but much of the heavy weaponry of the rebels that have contributed significantly to their effectiveness on the battlefield has come from the Syrian army. And you see this all the time on YouTube, where they capture significant numbers of weapons. Logistics for the rebels remains a major problem, right? The old saying is that battles are for amateurs and logistics is for professionals, right? And the rebels still have significant problems with the ammunition supply, keeping weapons in the field, and so on. Basically, logistics for the rebels are negotiated. Operations are also negotiated. There isn't a system that pushes ammunition or whatever to units on any kind of rational or planned basis. The units that have the ammunition are the units that have money, external support, and are successful on the battlefield. Other units that don't have those things have much less ammunition. There's a number of videos out there showing rebel commanders distributing handfuls of bullets to their troops. Right? That's for sure not every unit, but you still see these problems where some rebel units simply don't have ammunition, and we still get reports of the rebels basically being defeated or having to withdraw from combat because they run out of ammunition. Even units that you would think that shouldn't happen. One of the most important things in assessing any kind of military organization is the combat qualities of the forces. Right? Their discipline, cohesion, willingness to fight, leadership, those kinds of things. So, sometimes these are called the even quantifiables. And what we see, I think, with rebel forces is a great variation in this. You have some rebel forces that are amateurs. They don't know how to use their weapons, and so on. So there's a significant issue here with the rebels of a very great, significant variation in the abilities of units and combat qualities of the units. And what this does is it makes for very uneven performance on the battlefield. Some rebel units, unfortunately, these are mostly on the Islamist side, side of the equation, seem to have high combat quality. They fight hard. They fight, even in very difficult circumstances, and so on. The strategy for the rebels, simply doesn't exist, right? There's some broad notions of, bringing down the regime and having democracy and all that. But in terms of military strategy, in normal situations, let's say, you have political goals that are set by the political leadership, and you have a military strategy that implements that. Because of the chaotic state of the political leadership, there is no real strategy, no political goals that can be communicated to forces, and that they will then go out and execute. You have, you have this sort of, every man does what he wants kind of situation. I think it's important. I'm getting the hook here to get off, but another major thing we see here is attrition. I talked about this a little bit. As of the end of July, when the last time I really crunched the data, the rebels were losing about 32 killed in action per day. Okay? I'm sorry, the regime was losing about 32. The rebels were losing about 52 killed in action today. 32 from regime regular forces, right? What we're seeing now, though, is increasing numbers of what's called the National Defense Forces. These are the regime irregulars. Increasing numbers of those people are being killed in combat, which is a logical extension of their increasing role. The regime's lost, according to the rebels, claimed loss of about 120 aircraft. That's, I think, certainly an exaggeration, but they continue to suffer attrition amongst the Air Force units, and in particular, they've lost a lot of helicopters. The regime's helicopter fleet has been significantly degraded. In terms of armored vehicles, we see continued attrition of the regime's armored vehicle fleet. Now, it had a huge armored vehicle fleet because they prepared for war with Israel. But they are continuously losing armored vehicles, and especially tanks and BMPs. systems that they heavily rely on. And I took a look at this as well as I could, and between March and July, over 600 tanks and BMPs were claimed to have been destroyed, damaged in combat, or at least hit. And that's not a small number. Some vehicles can be put back into action if you were able to recover them, but that's a significant number. So, in closing, I'd say that the big challenge here, for the rebels, and to some extent they've met it over time, is they have to keep pace with the regime, or actually get ahead of it. They can't fall behind the regime in a military sense. It looked in June like they were definitely doing that. More recently, it looks like they've steadied themselves into coming back. But I would say, though, that the single greatest weakness of the rebels is the disaster at the political echelon and the failure to have any kind of effective overall military command that could execute any kind of real national military strategy. These are weaknesses that cannot be cured by giving them more weapons. These are weaknesses that have to be cured either by the arrival of a de Gaulle-like figure who can hammer them together, or by somebody from the outside imposing some order and sense on the higher levels of rebel organizations. With that, I'll conclude.
Thanks for that, Jeff, and thanks to all of you for coming out today for lunch. I'm going to deal a little bit with the opposition politically and sort of take off where Jeff left off in his presentation. I've been dealing with the Syrian opposition now for about 13 years in one way, shape, or form. And it's changed a lot over time. There are a lot of theories out there. The one thing you always hear about the Syrian opposition is that it's disorganized and it's unable to come up with a coherent linear leadership, and it's unable to plan. All of these things are true, but that doesn't mean that they're not worth investigating. And I think they're very much a force under formation. Everyone also has different theories about why this is. Some folks here in town have argued, well, it's because the Qataris and the Saudis and the Turks and everyone else, they fund different groups and they have different clients inside of the country, and therefore that's what's causing the divisions. Others say it's the sectarian divisions in the country. There might be something to those theories. I have my own. It goes back to my original dealings with the Syrian opposition and the older opposition, as I call them, inside of Syria when I lived there. I think that there's a certain psychological aspect to it that's often overlooked. I write about this a little bit, and I introduce my piece, my segment of this work with it. When you have people who emerge from living under a tyrannical system like the Assad regime, which is so unbelievably brutal, and where power is so arbitrary, during the time that they're under the boot, so to speak, they're terribly depressed and smoke a lot of cigarettes, eat a lot of calorific food. In fact, at least a half an inch or not more around my midsection is directly due to very long interviews with people pontificating about why they wanted to free Syria. And I enjoyed listening to them. I have the recordings of almost all of them. But the fact of the matter is that oftentimes, we noticed this back even before the uprising began, when they began to see the light, when they began to emerge from that malaise, when they began to actually stand up for themselves, unfortunately, depression gives way almost immediately to grandiosity. And I think that's what really drives a lot of members within the Syrian opposition. Oftentimes when you meet with them at conferences, they'll talk more about them and their individual aspirations than their collective body or their party or the Syrian opposition as a whole. And it's an unfortunate characteristic of a number of the members of the opposition coming out of Syria then and coming out of Syria today. And I think that then what happens is a lot of people in the region, different sponsors and so on, then take advantage of it. But for as problematic as that is, such divisions have actually created exactly the kind of headless opposition that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad cannot decapitate. And they've just really, while they've proven the Achilles heel of the opposition, they also make it's one of its survival strategies. And over time, I think if many of you have watched this over the course of the development of the uprising in Syria, the regime has quite unsuccessfully played a very nasty game of whack-a-mole, where they try and wipe out an opposition division or a fighting force, only for it to pop up somewhere else. It does wear the regime down considerably. Unfortunately, though, with considerable Iranian assistance, Russian assistance, and political cover, the regime has been able to continue doing this, and it's led to over 100,000 killed in the country, and no end in sight, and unfortunately the use of chemical weapons inside of the country. My piece then talks a little bit about, looking back, I spent a lot of time alongside opposition members from the beginning of the uprising going forward. It wasn't just in the Western capitals or in Istanbul or some of the Arab capitals. I spent a tremendous amount of time in border regions, both with the civilian opposition as well as the armed opposition from a very early stage, and watched their development. My piece talks a little bit about the development of the Syrian National Council, which is now a part of what's called SOC, the Syrian Opposition Coalition, and its development and its own problems, both with personalities as well as coming up with a common platform, and being able to really unable to overcome not only personal differences but the differences between the three currents that were within the SNC and continue today into the SOC. One are the liberals, the other are the Muslim Brothers, and the third are the Salafists. Over time, unfortunately, the SNC, especially early on, did not spend enough time in border regions. They lost their traction inside of the country, both with first the peaceful protesters inside of Syria, and then over time with the armed groups who began firing back at the Assad regime's attempts to put down the uprising in the fall of 2011 and forward. I was also, this piece also deals considerably with the attempt by the international community last autumn to assemble the SNC and to get it to reform. And by reform, the goals of the regional powers as well as the United States was to get the SNC to branch out inside of the country and to essentially pack the SOC with more members from inside of the country than those in the SNC who were primarily in exile. That attempt happened in Doha, Qatar, and in November of last year. It was a mixed success or a mixed failure, however you want to look at it. Representation from inside of the country did increase. The SNC's participation inside of the organization was maintained at about 40%. But unfortunately, many of those that were included from inside of the country were not based on any kind of selective process from within their individual districts, but were instead handpicked by many of the same currents that were inside of the SNC. And the overall effectiveness of SOC inside of the country expanded, but didn't expand enough, and as per the outlines and the intentions of a number of those, not only within the Syrian opposition, who wanted to see the body come together, but also some of their Western and Arab patrons. Now, a little-known story that happened alongside this meeting in November of 2012, there was a parallel meeting in Doha of the different provincial military council leaders. And they sort of had a parallel meeting in order to try to organize the different groups, fighting groups inside of Syria into something coherent. That meeting was followed by an official meeting on December 7th in Antalya, Turkey, to form what was called the Supreme Military Council, or what's today known as the SMC, which is, of course, headed by General Idris. There were a couple of early signs that there was a lot of outside fingerprints on the SMC. For example, all the 230 members who were present that day in Antalya agreed suddenly by consensus to the 30-member leadership body that currently heads the SMC. For someone that's tracked the Syrian opposition, that is nothing short of a miracle. But actually, I think one of the main reasons why the SMC was formed so quickly was because of the presence and the involvement of Western and Arab intelligence agencies. And there were a lot of reasons for that. I don't say that they're not justified. There were a lot of concerns at that time that the number of that the weapons going into Syria were indiscriminate, that they were going to extremists within the opposition, and that some sort of organized structure, and that by channeling all of the weapons via one source would hopefully bring the armed units together inside of the country. The SMC today as it stands is actually a blend of two regional models. One is the Qatari-based Provincial Military Council model, and the other was the Saudi-backed Five Fronts model. And if you look at the diagram, which you'll find inside of, it's an excellent diagram put out by the Syria Support Group here in Washington, it outlines all the different fronts and also its membership. If you look at first glance, if you look at the membership of the SMC, it seems like any foreign government's dream of a coherent, linear opposition structure that would be needed to arm an insurgency against the Assad regime and hopefully take it down. It's organized into operations branches, intelligence branches, supply, equipment, administration, finance, even transitional justice of all things, according to each one of the fronts, and I encourage you to look at them. Politically, however, and what you can look at in terms of the individuals who are listed on here, all of them have quite different political orientations. This structure was actually originally formed in discussions in the summer of 2012 that were happening behind closed doors between members of the Syrian opposition and Western and Arab intelligence agencies. At that time in the Syrian armed opposition, Salafists and other extremists were not prevalent among the armed opposition. So the structure that we see here today, and you'll see in the diagram, is a collection of nationalists battalions that could be secular or mildly Islamist, but are primarily focused on Syria. But they are mixed together also with those of a jihadist, of a Salafist orientation. So one of the sort of giant pink elephants or white elephants or whatever you want to call it in the room on the SMC is the role of Salafists. Now originally, this wasn't seen as a bad idea because there was an attempt, and I think it was quite thoughtful, that the important thing was to co-opt some of the moderate Salafists who only had aspirations for an Islamic State within Syria, to co-opt them into this structure so that they then over time could be moderated and could be dealt with and incorporated into an overall resistance against the Assad regime. And I think that probably would have had a better chance of happening had this structure been armed and financed at the time that it was originally constructed. And I think I can point you to the deliberations and some of the stories about the deliberations inside of the American administration, specifically Hillary Clinton's and others' backing of the arming of this structure in general. But that path was not taken. And over time, the Syrian opposition continued to fight against the Assad regime, and quite formidably, and actually did a very good job. But in order to carry that out, it had to rely on patrons from the Arab Gulf, North Africa, and beyond to sustain it with financing and with weaponry. And unfortunately, a lot of that financing and weaponry went to Salafists and other extremist groups within the Syrian opposition milieu. These are outside of primarily the SMC, however. But in any case, they grew in stature and in overall firepower. So the situation has changed considerably since then. And now there's a real question in looking at the SMC about what to do with it. President Obama and Ben Rhodes have announced that originally in terms of enforcing the red line on Syria's chemical weapons use in Syria, and this, of course, the most recent incident was not the first, that the United States would increase its support, its military support, for the Supreme Military Council specifically. So we're not arming or supporting the Free Syrian Army as a whole, but actually the Supreme Military Council. But as you've seen in the press, that has gone with ebbs and flows, and it's come out in a trickle, and there's been a lot of complaints about the late delivery of those weapons. There are several reasons for that. One is arguments over, well, how effective can this really be? Because the fight in Syria has ended up in the division of the country. Some call it a stalemate. And whatever we provide to them would not lead to the toppling of the Assad regime, but only sustaining the fight. But the other, more enduring argument has been that actually supplying the SMC wholesale could and will likely lead to those weapons falling into the hands of Salafists and extremists. I argue in this piece that as the SMC is currently constructed, that is a distinct possibility. However, I'm not rejecting the SMC as a vehicle for supporting the opposition, but rather, and we talk about this in the paper, and I think this is also partially borne out by the findings of my colleague Aaron Zelin, what we instead need going forward, and I think is the wisest choice, and I think it's actually the one slowly being adopted by the administration that accounts for the trickle out of assistance, is the discriminate support and arming of different members within the SMC with whom we have already existing relations, both and also those that are more of a secular nationalist orientation and are not against U.S. interests, not only in Syria, but the region as a whole. It's very difficult stuff. It's a political game using military means, but it's one that we're going to have to play ever so carefully if we are going to win the overall battle inside of Syria. And by winning the overall battle, what I mean by that is eventually getting President Assad to leave the scene, and hopefully having at the end of this negotiations between three different parts of Syria. It's current, and I have a piece in Foreign Affairs that outlines Syria's de facto division into a regime canton, a Sunni Arab canton, and also a Kurdish canton, to get those pieces of Syria to eventually come back together. But that's a very medium or long-term goal at this point. So I talk a little bit about, in the piece, about a couple of the examples of what's happened so far concerning the SMC. There has been an attempt using Croatian arms financed by Saudi Arabia to finance a number of the more moderate elements inside of Syria. And it's called the Croatian arms episode or incident, in which those weapons were provided, and within a very short time, some of those weapons ended up in the hands of extremists. Now, just to be clear here, the weapons were not given to the SMC as a whole, but some of the groups within the SMC were armed. So it's not a hard test. It's rather like a soft one. Nevertheless, a number of weapons that were supplied, according to evidence that was taken by the internet and is explained by myself and by Aaron Zelin, those weapons ended up in the hands of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate currently active inside of Syria. So what I argue in the end is a cautious middle way forward. And I realize that this, in the context of the overall enforcement of the red line, seems a bit getting ahead of ourselves. But what I can assure you is whatever happens in the next 48 hours or so, the war in Syria is going to go on. It's going to go on for a very long period of time. And in de facto sense, from a policy angle, what we've gone from is having a Syria that was a U.S. state sponsor of terrorism into 3 Syrias now in which U.S. designated terrorist organizations are not only present, but they are ascendant. And that strategy, rather that situation, which some have written recently in the New York Times and otherwise, of having each faction just kind of fight it out and actually work against each other instead of the United States, that only really works if that doesn't spill over the borders of Syria and destabilize Syria's neighbors, almost all of which are U.S. allies. Unfortunately, that spillover is already occurring, whether it's in the record number of refugees fighting across the border, the spike in sectarian tensions throughout Syria and around Syria. Syria, as many of us at the Institute have said, isn't Vegas. What happens there is not going to stay there. And I think you can see in President Obama's most recent statements, he's talked about the impact of the Syria crisis overall on our regional allies. And I expect that while I realize that the strikes appear that will be coming to enforce the chemical weapons red line on the Syrian regime, and I support that. I've supported it from even before the president outlined this. Whatever happens out of that, the president is going to obviously be talking about the punitive measures involved, and I think Mike's going to be talking about that. But overall, I think that the president is going to have to address, and the government's going to have to address, about the strategic threats that are coming out of the Syria crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, this meltdown of this country is not going to end anytime soon. And if I could tell you which way it's going, I would, but I can't. None of us can. But what you can see is as this meltdown continues, the level of threats to the United States and its allies are going through the roof. Therefore, more assertive U.S. action, whether it's in enforcing the red line or discriminately arming the SMC as a vehicle to supporting the overall armed opposition, seems the best road ahead. It's going to be a careful and difficult effort, but I think it's one that we're up for, and I think being more assertive now instead of waiting for others in the region or adversaries to take our place would be the best way forward. Thank you very much.
Andrew, Jeff, great monograph. Aaron Zelin couldn't be here today, so I'm kind of standing in for him as a poor man's Aaron Zelin. I have been asked to talk about the implications of potential U.S. military operations in Syria. And when undertaking these kind of exercises, I always find it very useful to refer to the quote by the famous theorist of warfare, Prussian theorist of warfare, Karl von Clausewitz, who said, "The first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking." Which basically, I think, leads us to ask, if the United States does act militarily in response to Syria's escalated use of chemical weapons, what are our likely goals? How are we likely to go about achieving these goals? What are the prospects for success? And how is Syria and its allies likely to respond? Now, in considering American policy objectives, if it does resort to the use of force, there are a number of these that one could kind of spell out potentially. First, simply making a statement. And Secretary of State Kerry has talked about the need for accountability, and in its own way, therefore, action would be simply kind of, would stand on its own as kind of America responding, as White House spokesman Jay Carney says, America responding to an act that needs a response. We could also try to restore U.S. credibility and deter future chemical weapon use. That's the second objective we could pursue. Third is to alter the balance of forces between the regime and opposition forces to set conditions for either a diplomatic settlement or an opposition victory. Or, finally, a decapitation and regime change. Although White House spokesman Jay Carney said that's off the table. We're not seeking regime change. And I think even trying to alter the balance of forces is something which is the administration is not likely to pursue. So I think other than making a statement, I think the likely minimal goal of any kind of military action would be restore credibility and deter future chemical weapons use. So how might we go about achieving this? I think the first thing that's important to say is that, at least based on the newspaper descriptions of the kind of strike we can expect, and they're talking about, the 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers in the Eastern Mediterranean as being the likely source of a strike. Each of them carries probably a couple of dozen Tomahawk land attack missiles. They're probably accompanied by 1 or 2 attack submarines. These actually have potentially much larger numbers of Tomahawks on board. Some of them can carry up to 150 Tomahawks. So you're talking perhaps a strike of 100 to 200 Tomahawk missiles. When you think about it in terms of the size of the warheads on the missiles and the types of warheads, you're talking about something that really equates to a single sortie of between 35 and 50 strike aircraft, which is what a single aircraft carrier carries. So you're not talking about a very big strike here, first of all. And as a result, you're not likely to significantly degrade Syrian military capabilities. And therefore, I would argue, if this is the kind of strike the administration feels comfortable with, they should focus not really on degrading capabilities, but altering the regime's risk calculus and achieving mainly a psychological effect. And I think the only way to really accomplish this, or maybe it's not the only way, but I think the most desirable way of accomplishing this is by targeting key regime units. Now, the Syrian army is a 12-plus division army, but in fact, in prosecuting their fight against the opposition, they've only really used more or less 3 divisions: the 4th Armored Division, the Republican Guard Division, and some Special Forces units. These units are key to the survival of the regime. defending the regime against coups and stuff like that. They're key to prosecuting the war against the opposition. And at least the 4th Armored Division and Republican Guard have been deeply implicated in the use of chemical weapons against the Syrian people. So you can hit headquarters of these units. Those are fixed sites. Conceivably, it would be desirable, although tomahawks are really not the best way to do this, or even not really a good way to do this. It would be desirable also to be able to destroy a large number of their tanks and artillery. But more importantly, it's to kill the senior leadership of these units or senior members of these units. The problem is, even if you destroy large numbers of tanks and artillery of these units, like I said, only 3 divisions out of the 12 divisions in the military are really committed to combat. So you conceivably have a large stockpile of tanks and artillery pieces that belong to other units that are not being used. And while maybe a lot of them have not been maintained and are rusty and are not functional, they could cannibalize these other units. What is critical, what they really are short of, is loyal soldiers. And therefore, it's much more important to kill, experienced, committed troops. The more senior, the better, because the more senior people are probably related by blood and marriage to senior officials in the regime. But the problem is also now, since we've telegraphed our preparations to strike, they're probably not going to be in their headquarters or by their tanks when they were to strike. We know this from our experience with Iraq, where time and again we hit empty headquarters. And even when we tried to bomb chemical weapons facilities, the chemical weapons were out in the fields rather than in the bunkers. So the problem is, because of the lack of advanced warning, I think we have a limited ability to accomplish this objective at this point. And in addition, I'm not sure that the administration would go for this, because in order to do it effectively, again, you have to rely on combat aircraft. Tomahawks are not the optimal tool to do a lot of this. So that creates a problem in terms of the efficacy of this kind of strike. I think it's also, in considering how we fashion the strike, if we are to go down this path, that we not respond in an asymmetric fashion to Syrian provocations, because that enables the regime to calibrate risk. And this is something that we consistently fell into this trap with the Iraqis in the 90s, that they would challenge us in the no-fly zones, and we would hit the surface-to-air missile sites that challenged us. And really, the regime had an almost inexhaustible supply of air defense systems and personnel. They were not high on the regime's priority list in terms of, they weren't so important for the regime, and they could afford to lose these if they wanted to challenge us. And likewise with their WMD facilities. So it's important in the face of provocations not to respond in a symmetric manner, but to hit other sites that are really critically important for the regime. Again, like units that are key to prosecuting the fight against the opposition. And I think it would also be desirable, if we could do it, to intimate that whatever we do is not a parting shot, but it's an opening salvo. In other words, there's more is yet to come. The problem is, again, the administration has, perhaps I think for good reasons, been so reluctant to get directly involved. It has telegraphed its reluctance, and that any kind of military action, I think, will be seen as likely a one-off event, or at least the administration's preference would be that it be a one-off event. And therefore, I think psychologically, the regime in Damascus will feel if they could ride it out, then they'll be free to continue with their depredations afterwards. So if there was a way to intimate that more is yet to come, that would be desirable. And one way we could do that, perhaps, is part of any strike, you try to degrade their air defenses so that you could set the conditions for future strikes. If you use manned aircraft in the future, that they will be operating in a less hostile air defense environment. I think it's also important, in terms of changing the psychology of the regime, to have supporting diplomatic moves to any military action. All these things that the Saudis are doing to try to pull away the Russians, I think, good luck. I'm very skeptical they'll work, but I think these kind of efforts are desirable to the degree that they maybe plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the Syrians about the reliability of the Russians, because we know in Kosovo, one of the things that caused Slobodan Milosevic to eventually cave was the loss of Russian support. So the Russians are fickle allies, and anything that sows doubt in the mind of the regime in Damascus about their reliability is important. Iran, I think that's a harder target. I think we're less likely to be able to peel them away. But I will note that I think we have a great information opportunity here, in that, one of the deep wounds in Iranian society is the fact that they were victims of chemical warfare, that the international community was silent. This is one of their most powerful talking points in terms of domestic opinion and world opinion. And I think we should relentlessly make the point that they are supporting a regime that is using chemical weapons against civilians. And I wonder if they are getting advice from their Iranian allies about how to most effectively use them. So this is, I think, a great IO talking point that we should be pressing. I'm not sure in the long run it'll have a tangible effect on Iranian policy, but it's something we should be working on. Now, let me just make a couple of points in terms of lessons from the past that we should also keep in mind when, if we go down the military route. First of all, coercive strikes are almost never one-off deals. I think it'll be very important for the regime in Damascus to try to prove that they are unbowed and that they will try to, once again, violate the red line, perhaps by, once again, resuming the use of chemical weapons, though maybe on a very low level, which will then put the U.S. administration in the horns of a dilemma. Do you strike again in response to a very small use, local use of a chemical weapon that maybe killed only 10 or 15 people? And they will be able to make the point that, you gave us, was that your best shot, and it didn't affect our conduct. And we also, we know this from our experience in dealing with the Iraqis in the 90s, that it was a constant struggle, kind of a cat and mouse game, cheat and retreat with the Iraqis, and the Israelis have had similar issues with dealing with rocket fire from Gaza and Hezbollah after their withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000. And it was only until that the Israelis engaged in very far-reaching military operations that they were successful, at least in dealing with the threat from Hezbollah, and have had mixed results in dealing with Hamas. But again, I don't see the U.S. engaging in those kind of, very far-reaching military operations at this point. The second lesson from the past is get it right from the start, and don't try to deter or manage the problem on the cheap. And again, this is one of the lessons from Iraq in the 90s. I think the operation that we did, that I think finally put together all the elements of a successful coercive policy, was Operation Desert Fox in 1998. But that was intended as a parting shot. We had given up on the inspections at that time, and it was I see it as really a face-saving effort to kind of hit the Iraqis hard as we were walking away, to kind of provide political cover for an administration decision to give up on UN weapons inspections. Though it would have been better if those kind of operations were, if we carried out those kind of operations at the beginning of our coercive diplomacy in the early 90s with the Iraqis, because maybe the decade would have, we would have had an easier time with the UN weapons inspections if we had started with those kind of operations. Just a few points about the nature of the challenges we're likely to face, and then the type of Syrian responses we're likely to see before I wrap up here. As I mentioned before, given advance warning of the U.S. strike, key personnel are not likely to be in the headquarters that may be targeted if we were to target senior headquarters. By relying exclusively on cruise missiles, there are limits to what you can accomplish, simply because even though our most advanced cruise missile has the ability to be updated in flight in terms of the target that it's going to hit, the intelligence that it is based on is very often several hours old, whereas a pilot overflying a target looking through a targeting pod can in real time determine what's on the ground that he's going to hit. So there are limits to what you could accomplish with TLAM if the enemy is moving things around on a frequent basis, which again I assume the Syrians might do. Also, a limited strike of the type that it seems that we're planning would preclude the U.S. from hitting assets that the Syrians might rely on for retaliation, such as surface-to-surface missiles or anti-ship cruise missiles or chemical weapons stockpiles. And all the newspaper reporting indicates that the United States is not likely to hit chemical weapons stockpiles for fear of collateral damage. That might be disinformation, or that might be the truth that we might yet find out in the next few days. But clearly, based on our experience in dealing with chemical, in targeting WMD-type targets, we know from our experience that accurate and timely intelligence is absolutely vital, and our track record in this regard is very uneven. We also have to consider the fact that all the reports have said that in recent months the Syrians have been consolidating their chemical weapons arsenal and moving them around in order to prevent the opposition from gaining them. So even if we had a perfect picture at the start of the conflict where they were, once they started moving it around, it makes it much more difficult. And even if we know which bases they consolidated them on, we don't necessarily know which buildings they're in. So that could also complicate targeting. And then, given the advanced telegraphing of the possibility that the U.S. will strike, it's possible that they've also been dispersed now, as the Iraqis did on the eve of the 91 war. In terms of Syrian responses, my feeling is that the last thing that Syria needs is to open a second front at this time. They still have their hands full dealing with the opposition, and therefore I think their response will be very limited at best. I would simply note that Israel attacked Syria in 2007 when they bombed its reactor, and 4 times this year without an overt response by Syria yet. And Syrian officials have been pretty restrained in their statements in terms of what they're going to do if the U.S. bombs them, except for statements that they'll defend themselves, but there's no kind of bravado-filled statements that they will set the region on fire. Their potential for proxy terrorism is much more limited than it was in the past today, and our ability to stop these kind of activities is much better since 9/11. And as I said before, therefore, repeated, intermittent, and limited use of chemical weapons is their most likely response, I think, to bombing, in order, again, just to make the case that you bombed us and still we're doing it, and are you going to bomb us again for 10, 20 people killed by chemical weapons? And again, putting the administration on the horns of dilemma. I'll leave Hezbollah and Iran for maybe the Q&A, because I want to wrap it up now. But again, I think for various reasons, I don't see them acting in a big way in response to a U.S. strike. In conclusion, as for the possibility of a U.S. military strike, my recommendation would be either do it right or don't do it at all. And that probably means doing it right means probably a more expansive strike than is being considered by the current administration. Secondly, if you do it, don't expect this to be a one-off deal, because it'll be very important for Assad to show that he's unbowed and undefeated, and he will continue to test our red line. And then finally, kinetic action of the type that the administration appears to be considering, I think, can only modestly at best reduce the potential threat of chemical weapons to the opposition. To really change the balance of forces in a positive way requires that we finally take seriously the possibility of arming the opposition. And I think this would, in the long run, be the kind of response that that potentially really matters. Thank you.
The one privilege of chairing an event like this is I get to ask the first question. So let me ask our panelists. I listen to you. I hear about a very decentralized, if not disorganized opposition. I hear about a regime which is increasingly relying on irregular forces. I hear about the limited actions which the United States is likely to take. And what was running through my mind was, well, are you saying that the United States can't make much of a difference in this conflict? And that really the United States can't do very much to influence it? And not only that the United States won't do very much to influence, but that really nothing short of very dramatic U.S. actions would have much of an impact?
Yeah, I think the limits of U.S. power are exaggerated. I think we can do a lot. We can, even a limited strike, provided it's not just kind of a rap on the knuckles or a symbolic tomahawking of a couple places in Damascus. Even that, I think, can have some important effects on the situation. Starting with what would be, what's been necessary, I think, and should have been done for a long time, is real military assistance to the rebels. Now, this requires, the vetting business, all that, running some risk that weapons, as Andrew outlined, might migrate into the hands of people we don't like and don't like us. But you have to think about, the importance of the objectives here. And if you assume that getting Assad out of power
and defeating the Iranians in Syria are important objectives, then certainly those kinds of risks are worth taking. We could do a lot to help the rebels beyond just giving them some anti-aircraft and anti-tank guided missiles. I mean, there's lots of things we can do in the way of training, advice on how to operate, helping them form real command centers, real command structures, providing them with effective logistics for their forces, and so on, that we could do in the future, we should have been doing for some time. That is not going to guarantee, the democratic future society in Damascus or in Syria that everybody wants, but it would at least help influence in that direction and give the U.S. some ability to influence the situation on the ground post-Assad. The other thing is we could do, of course, a lot more in terms of direct military intervention. And this is something also that should have been contemplated and probably undertaken long before where we are now. But we could still do that. The regime, as I outlined in my comments, the regime relies on firepower significantly. We can reduce that firepower. We can stop the Syrian Air Force from killing civilians on a daily basis. We can destroy the Syrian surface missile forces. We can degrade their command and control. We can take away a lot of the advantages they enjoy, vis-a-vis the rebels with direct military action. So to say that the United States doesn't have the ability to influence the situation in Syria is wrong. We could expedite the removal of the regime, significantly expedite it. But can we fix Syria? Can we ensure the democratic future, whatever? No, we can't. But we can certainly do some important things there.
Just briefly to echo Jeff's comments, I think that really in the end it's a situation where the U.S. could do a lot more. But again, it's not just through either direct or indirect intervention. Although I agree with the way Jeff set it up, I think it's just in terms of understanding what power is. I mean, the big problem that I see is that we are used, particularly with Syria, we're used to dealing with Syria through its regime, and we had a very close, not political relationship with Syria, but our intelligence services knew each other very well, and that was very clear. When I'm watching the operations of the U.S. Embassy in Damascus over the years when I was there, we knew them quite well. We cooperated with them in a certain sense. That structure, the one that we're very familiar with, and those elites that go around it, that system became destabilized. And again, it gets back to the demographics that have changed in the country. If you look at all the videos that come out of the fighting units, you find very, very few gray hairs among those that are taking shots against the Assad regime. There are all of those that were born in those horrific 10 years after the Hama massacre of 1982, when Syria was among the top 20 fastest growing populations on the planet. I mean, it's just the numbers have radically changed. And so when you meet with these groups inside of Syria or in Syrian border regions, it's a whole new set of elites. The people inside of Syria now matter. The question is, what do we do with them? Do we ignore them and pretend that the currents streaming through the opposition are not there and just let them fester and grow? Or do we try and influence that environment? And I don't think that's just a part of U.S. policy in Syria or a part of Syria policy or part of Syria policy during this crisis. I think it's going to have to be part of our U.S. Middle East policy in general. How are we going to deal with people? People are a factor in these countries. Economics matters. The social aspects matter. It's not just going to be state to state anymore. So I think a much more assertive role for the United States, a smarter role, combined with some of the options that Jeff has outlined, would be the right move going ahead.
Yeah, and all I'll just add, because I agree with the comments of my colleagues here, is that all I was saying is that, based on what's been reported in the media, apparently based on background and not for attribution briefings by senior officials, what the administration seems to be considering is not likely, at least by my lights, to achieve the desired objective. So I was just simply saying, you know, if we want to accomplish our objectives, defined minimally as deterring further CW use, we probably need to think about a different way of going about doing it. But that said, you know, I think we can do more to shape the environment, but ultimately we can hopefully try to set conditions for the success of the opposition, but in the end it's up to them. But I think we have an important role to play in helping them get there. So,
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Right there.
Yeah, Ken Meyer, Court World Docs. A question for Mr. Eisenstadt. Keeping in mind that propaganda for war is a violation of the UN Charter and hence a potential war crime, what evidence do you have to support your claim that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons?
yeah, I first of all, I'm waiting to see what the UN inspectors say, and I'm looking to see what the U.S. Government has to say on this regard. And I think that's why the administration actually has said, it's kind of interesting. The administration has said that they're waiting. They're not waiting for the UN report because they feel that they have very detailed intelligence, and supposedly it's going to be revealed later this week. I don't recall. I don't remember exactly how I said it. I would say alleged. If I said that they use CW, I would say allegations of CW use, and I would wait to see what the report says personally. So I don't recall exactly what I said in my presentation, but I would like to see exactly what the evidence the U.S. government has to put on the table. But to be honest with you, given that this administration was elected in part due to their criticism of the preceding administration for going to war without adequate, intelligence related to WMD, I would hope that they would cross all their T's and dot all their I's when it comes to doing the vetting of the intelligence related to Syria. And therefore, if the Secretary of State says that there's no doubt, and the Vice President says there's no doubt that Syria used chemical weapons, I would probably invest a high degree of confidence in that. But again, I will want to see what kind of reports they come out with in the coming days.
I would take a rather different perspective on that one. Can I weigh in? The United States government has long had a perspective with regard to nuclear weapons, about something we call the loose nukes problem, which is to say that if a nuclear weapon is used, we're going to blame the person who produced the nuclear weapon, whether or not it was in their control at the time or not, because every government that produces nuclear weapons has a responsibility under international law to keep those weapons in their control. And if the Syrian government has lost control of chemical weapons, and those chemical weapons are used by the rebels, that's the fault of the Syrian government. The Syrian government has a responsibility, in other words, to keep control over chemical weapons that it produces, and it's in its territory. And if they've lost control of chemical weapons, they need to bring this to the attention of the international community, which I suspect will be prepared to assist them in controlling those chemical weapons. So I think the more important question we should ask about what happened in Syria last week is, were chemical weapons used? And if the answer is chemical weapons were used, that's the responsibility of the Syrian government.
Yeah, I would say that we don't have 100% forensic evidence yet of regime complicity or regime decision, whatever, to use CW. But we have everything but that, right? We don't have NCIS Damascus to go in there and do these things, and so we're going to have to wait for the UN people to come back with their report. But what the UN people are only going to say is, yeah, chemical weapons are used, and it looks like it may have been this type of agent. We kind of know that, right? The issue is resolving, to some degree of certainty or high probability that the regime did it or somebody else did it, right? And if you look at the regime, right, means, they have the very formidable chemical warfare capabilities, right? Methods, they have the units, the concepts, the training to conduct chemical warfare attacks, right? So the opportunity was there, and they also had at least some, a reasonable military rationale, for striking. They're having trouble in the Damascus area with rebel forces. They've been trying to clear the very areas that were struck for months and have not been successful. In that fighting, they've lost troops, they've lost tanks and other armored vehicles, they've lost personnel from their allies, right, without any significant progress. Some progress, but without any significant progress. And the rebels are having their own successes in those areas. So there's plenty of stuff that points to the regime having done it. Scale, all kinds of things. Right? So it takes a leap of faith to believe it wasn't the regime. More than a leap of faith, it takes a kind of fantasy to believe it wasn't the regime. So, but we'll see, right? It's not like you said, it's not 100%. But plus, we have a lot of reporting of actual intelligence evidence, SIGINT imagery, and so on, that definitely points at regime use.
Just to remind the audience, from the beginning, the UN team is not allowed to actually, by its current mandate, and this was negotiated over 5 months. It took 5 months to negotiate with the Syrian government over the sites that would be inspected. It is not allowed to assess blame for who used the weapons. This is a very important point. It can only assess if they are present in the sites. So it's out. So no matter what the UN says in a couple of days, it's not that team is not going to say who used the weapons.
Larry Smerin, Hudson Advisory Group, and my questions is here generally for the speakers. In thinking about the stratification of the Syrian opposition movement, I'm more reflective on the stratification, I think, of the Syrian government. Now, the reason I say that is Bashar Assad, as I understand it, was basically a pinch hitter. His father, Hafez Assad, was grooming his elder son, Basil, to be his successor. Basil was killed in an auto accident. Bashir was brought back, was a happy ophthalmologist in London. He was brought back and quickly groomed to try to take over. And what I'm saying, and I'd like your comments, is he truly in charge? Does he rule or does he reign? That is to say, are there different centers of power, different military, political leaders who came up and made their reputations under his father, and that he basically is a uniting symbol, if you will, of Syria as opposed to actually ruling the country? That is to say, if...
Thanks. I think we got the question.
Okay.
Andrew?
I wrote a book about this, or at least it deals with this, and I spent a little over 7 years inside of Syria during the time that you're talking about under Bashar's reign. And one of the early explanations, there's always been some sort of question about how do we explain Bashar al-Assad's dual nature, where he's a mild-mannered ophthalmologist who studied for a time in London, who announces in his inaugural address when he took power from his father Hafez, as you mentioned, that Syrians should respect the views of others, but yet when Syrians went out and began to hold discussion salons about respecting those views and to try to organize a bit, there was a massive crackdown inside of the country. One of the early explanations for that was that Bashar was held back by the old guard, by some of the carryovers from his father's regime. Well, that view and that about letting Bashar off the hook in terms of responsibility for the actions inside one of the most centrally organized political systems in the world held until about 2005. In the 2005 Ba'ath Party conference, then most of those figures were retired from the father's reign, and then there were just the new figures. And then, of course, we had the crisis in Lebanon, and many people said, well, how could Bashar have decided to kill Rafiq Hariri, or made the political decision, or whatever? There were lots of questions, and they thought that there were other groups of people behind the scenes. One of whom was Asif Shaukat, who was the president's brother-in-law, who was married to Bushra, Bashar's sister. And that went along for a while, and then, of course, there's always been this mystery. Well, why did Bashar continue to be this nice guy in the interviews, but then turn around and was so unbelievably unpredictable, wanting peace with Israel, but supplying Scud missiles to Hezbollah in Lebanon? it's not only doesn't show that you want peace, it's also strategically stupid. You give strategic weapons to a non-state actor. You know, the only reason why Syria would be important is so it can hold back those weapons. Then, of course, this went along, and the uprising began, and the regime continued to fire on its own people, and it continued. And then there was a lot of talk that it was hardliners behind the regime, one of whom was Asif Shaukat. Well, then he was killed in July of 2012 in a massive explosion, and the firing continued. I think what the easy answer to this is, after 13 years of Bashar al-Assad plus being in power, that this is just who he is. I think, based on my knowledge, and we just released a study at the Institute about the current structure of the regime, it is completely centralized in the Assad family's hands, and I think that whatever deliberative process goes behind the scenes, I think it's within the family members. And I think that means that whatever happens regarding the regime in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, and particularly his brother, are complicit.
Thanks. This is a question for Mike. You talked about the use of combat aircraft as a possibility, a desirable option. What is your take on the state of Syrian air defenses? Some people seem to suggest it's rather formidable, but the Israeli staged a couple of attacks. Do you think it really would be formidable in terms of the somewhat degraded capability?
Yeah, it's really hard to know. On paper, clearly they have very extensive air defenses, very dense along the west side of the country, which is the populated part of the country, around Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and the coastline. So it's very dense air defenses, but most of it is what they call people call legacy systems from the Soviet systems. They're rather dated. There are some newer SAMs that are there that could pose a significant risk. I think the main question that I would ask is, given that we know that the ground forces have suffered significant desertions and absenteeism, and as a result they really can only rely on 3 divisions out of the 12 divisions in the army, are the air defenses suffering from the same problem? And again, we just don't know. I mean, they did successfully shoot down a Turkish Phantom that was apparently on a reconnaissance flight some time ago. So they are viable, but in terms of how effective, it's just really an unknown. But again, I think the main systems that almost all the systems are older systems that we're familiar with, and that I think we have pretty good capabilities to deal with. But in the past, we've lost aircraft, in very small numbers, onesies and twosies, to some of these older systems, and as a result, they remain a potential threat. But I think it's probably not as great as sometimes portrayed, but still something that we have to take very seriously.
We can't wish it away, for sure. If you're a U.S. Air Force or Navy planner, you have to account for those systems and deal with them. But we do know that the system overall has suffered a lot of degradation since the war. The rebels have overrun at least 2 SA-5 facilities, which is their kind of their main strategic system. They've overrun a number of SA-2 and SA-3 batteries and SAM support facilities. We also know that many of the air defense units, the SAM units, are involved in the ground war. Right? They serve as strong points to help the regime control areas. And many of the lighter anti-aircraft systems, mobile anti-aircraft gun systems, have been committed to combat in support of the Syrian army. So this is a system that, whatever its state was at the beginning of the war in March of 2011, it's less, maybe a lot less than it was then. And plus, there's the things that Mike pointed out. These are all systems we've basically gone against, successfully gone against, with the exception maybe of one particular system. So, but again, as I said at the beginning, you can't wish it away. It has to be accounted for in any kind of prudent planning process.
And I'll just add that the Israelis have conducted multiple operations over Syria, or perhaps at its margins, certainly within the range band of many of their systems, and successfully so.
You did mention just now, Michael, the Israeli going in,
and it was also mentioned earlier that they had made some strikes and there was no retaliation, just rhetorical. Yet the stories of the strikes are coming out of Washington, not out of Syria, not out of Israel. You read in the Israeli media that they're very pissed at the U.S. for leaking stories about their operations. What's going on with that?
Well, I have, who knows? Some speculation is that it's people at the State Department who are upset that we want us to have a more forward-leaning policy, and then therefore, leaking the stuff in order to kind of shame the administration to action. Others, maybe it's, maybe there are people who are concerned that Israeli action will lead to escalation and of the conflict, and therefore they want to deter the Israelis from acting. I don't know, and maybe it's all of the above, or maybe it's none of the above. Maybe it's just people who can't keep their mouths closed. So who knows? I don't know.
First of all, just congratulations on an amazing study, and to the Institute staff for getting out so quickly. Mike, I'm going to follow up on your offer to leave for the questions and answers the question of Iranian and Hezbollah retaliation. We'll talk more about Hezbollah at our event next week, but Hezbollah, as in today's media, seems to imply that, at least in one statement, that if it was a limited strike, that they wouldn't respond, but if it was something that seemed to aim at really undermining the regime, that they would. I'm wondering about your take.
I've always been, with regard to Hezbollah, you're the one who should be actually answering this question, but, Hezbollah is like Syria. I mentioned before that Syria doesn't need to open a second front at this point. They got their hands full, and therefore, as a result, I think their response would likely be very restrained. And I think the same goes for Hezbollah. First of all, as we know from some of your own work, Hezbollah and Israel are already engaged in a shadow war, and Hezbollah has been trying for several years now, for a variety of reasons, to avenge the killing of Imad Mukhnia and for other reasons, to conduct attacks against the Israelis. So they're already engaged in these kind of activities. So it's possible that does an Israeli strike cause them to ramp up these efforts? Well, these efforts, first of all, have not been successful except for the one attack in Bulgaria last year. I'm not so sure that they that they would be willing to incur significant additional risk on behalf of their Syrian allies. Although, like you said, to the degree that they see the survival of the regime in Damascus as critical for their own viability, that might make a difference. So if it is an attack that is geared towards regime change, maybe that does change their calculus. But I think all the telegraphing we're seeing in the media right now indicates that it's going to be a very limited strike, and therefore it's probably not worth the risk for them to put themselves out on the end of a limb for the regime in Damascus when they're not threatened right now with imminent overthrow.
I was just wondering, actually, Foreign Policy this morning released some leaked information, I guess, that that part of the intelligence that they have is that there were some cables or something between senior Assad officials over chemical weapons. So that's part of the evidence. But more to the point, I guess I was wondering that, Michael, I think you had mentioned maybe we could have some sort of dialogue with Iran, but Iran is threatening to strike Israel if we strike Syria. And so I guess I was wondering kind of two things. If you could just expand on kind of what effect a strike that we do could have on our neighbors, and also do you think that it's politically or operationally even bad that it looks like it might very well be the West versus going in kind of unilaterally at the West?
Yeah, with regard to Iran, first of all, I would note that I think it was about 3 days before the Israeli strike in Syria, or the reported Israeli strike in Syria in January against the SAM-17s that were supposedly being ready for transfer to Hezbollah. Ali Akbar Veliati, who's the Supreme Leader's foreign policy, one of his foreign policy advisors, he's a former foreign minister, said in the Iranian press that Iran, now of course he's an advisor, so he's not necessarily the most authoritative spokesman, but he said an Israeli attack on Syria would be taken as an Israeli attack on Iran. Well, the Israelis launched a strike several days later on the convoy, and Iran didn't do anything, and there's been several strikes since then. So I think in the event that the United States does decide to strike on Syria, I'm not sure, given all the things going on now with the nuclear negotiations and the like, that the Iranians necessarily want to act at this point. I think the way that they respond is perhaps by doubling down on their support for the Assad regime, which in a way they've already done. So they've often, their approach is generally to avoid direct conflicts with the United States or with other neighboring countries, and to act either through proxies or indirectly. So I think, like after the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, their way of responding, they didn't let all these people who were trying to volunteer to go over to fight with Hezbollah during the war, but they rearmed Hezbollah after the war. So I think their response here would be to double down with the Assad regime as a statement of defiance. The one about that's what the question about anti-American or anti-Western backlash. That's why I think it's very important for the United States to get the broadest possible coalition of the willing. If we can't get a UN Security Council resolution, it's very important to have the broadest number of countries supporting this effort and participating in it, and that's why also support from key Arab and Muslim countries is very important for this. For here.
Hi, Paula from the American Islamic Congress. My question is for all three of you. So thinking about the kind of opportunity that American missile strikes might provide to the opposition, first, is there an opportunity at all? And if so, who is best positioned to benefit both within the military and the political opposition, recognizing that there are certain entities that might benefit more than others? Just wondering if you could comment on that.
Groups that will benefit from within the opposition as a whole. I mean, the United States already extends about $1 billion or over $1 billion to the Syrian opposition. And what I mean by that is a combination of humanitarian aid and other kinds of assistance that's channeled already into Syria. And the reasons for that is not just because of our support for the Syrian opposition, and particularly for the Syrian opposition coalition, but there are other reasons for that. A lot of Western aid and international aid that's provided to Syria, and there's a lot of it, there's billions of dollars of it now. The Assad regime is still the sovereign power in Syria, still holds the UN seat. So therefore, the UN and the ICRC still have to deal through the regime in order to provide assistance in Syria. So in lots of areas where the opposition is prevalent and the regime is not, it's almost impossible to get assistance in without it. So the U.S. over the last year has changed course and has started moving assistance inside of the country. So politically, we provide assistance to a number of those in local councils and revolutionary councils and other individuals on the ground. In terms of the overall, the supreme, in terms of the armed groups, the primary recipients of any kind of assistance in our primary area for opportunity would be with members of the Supreme Military Council, and as I argue in the piece, that are not Salafist in orientation. It's not so much of an issue of ideology, but a lot of the Salafist groups over time in Syria, given the political situation, have lurched to the right and are closer to some of the extreme groups, which are U.S. designated terrorist organizations. So it's harder to find opportunities in the current context with Salafists rather than the mainline nationalist groups. I think those are the primary ones that we'll be dealing with in the short run, because we already deal with them. We already provide non-lethal assistance via these channels. Abul Jabbar Akidi, for example, is one figure. Afif Suleiman, and they're both in the structure that's outlined here, the graphic from the Syria Support Group. I think the initial opportunities will be with them, and then over time rolled out and increased in line with our, not only the increase in our assistance, but also the development of these individual leaders and their groups over time.
Yeah, I just add to that another criterion, besides they love us or like us or don't, at least don't hate us, is that they need to be militarily effective. Right? And it's not so easy to find highly military effective units that aren't of an Islamist stripe. We believe there's some that are fighting in the Dara area and some in the Dara province and some around Damascus that are not, too Islamist or too Salafist or whatever. But it's hard to really put your hand on it and say this is a unit that is moderate in its view, pro Western or U.S. or whatever, or even not against us, and is also effective. That's where the U.S. intelligence community and other intelligence communities really have to do their homework. To say this is a group that's ideologically okay, but also it's an effective combat unit or can be made to be one.
Well, I think you'll agree with me that our speakers today were both moderate and effective, and I'd like to thank them for their efforts and thank you for coming.